the media as the tourist from hell, Scripps became the first Westerner to be hanged in Singapore for murder, and only the second for any offense. Dutch citizen Johannes van Dam was executed by the Singapore authorities for drug trafficking in 1994. He was arrested on the 27th of September 1989, when he was found to be carrying 4 kilograms of heroin. He was sentenced to death on the 26th of April, 1993. Scripps is the last British murderer to be hanged since the abolishment of capital punishment in 1964. The last executions in Britain took place on the 13th of August of that year. Peter Anthony Allen, aged 21, was hanged at Walton Prison, Liverpool, and John Robson Walby, alias Gwyn Owen Evans, aged 24, was hanged at Strangeways Prison, Manchester. They had been jointly convicted of the murder of John West, a van driver from Workington, Cumberland, in the course of robbery. John Martin Scripps was born in Hartford on the 9th of December 1959. The family moved to London when he was a small boy, and he remembered a happy childhood in which he was close to his sister Janet. When he was 9 years old, he experienced the loss of his father, who committed suicide after he learned that his wife was leaving him for another man. John found his father at home with his head in the gas oven. At about the same time, his mother was diagnosed as having throat cancer, and although she recovered, John's world fell apart. According to the FBI, 70% of multiple murderers have undergone trauma at some point in their childhood. The trauma festers away and becomes a fantasy of getting revenge, says Ian Stephen, a forensic psychologist who works for the police and the prison service in Strathclyde. In Scripps's case, the anger might have been directed against the fact that he has been deprived of a father, deserted. John became increasingly introverted. He cut himself off from his friends and found it impossible to concentrate on learning to read and write. He acquired these skills later on, in prison, although his handwriting always remained very childish. At the age 14, he disappeared while at a training camp in France, organized by the Finchley Unit of the Army Cadet Force. A year later, he was in juvenile court for burglary and theft. His first adult conviction was for indecent assault in 1978, when he was fined £40 at Hendon Magistrates Court. Thereafter, it was a grim catalogue of offences including burglaries in London, followed by jail in Israel for stealing from a fellow kibbutz worker. In 1982, he was jailed again for burglary and assault in Surrey. He managed to abscond from the prison system and embarked on a crime journey throughout Southeast Asia and America. In Mexico, he met and married 16-year-old Maria Arellanos, but by 1985, he was back in Britain once again, facing a prison sentence for committing burglary. Prison could not hold him, and he absconded yet again to return to his drug smuggling activities in Southeast Asia and America. Justice caught up again with Scripps in 1987, when was jailed for 7 years in London for heroin offenses. The following year, his young Mexican wife divorced him. While on home leave from prison in June 1990, he disappeared for the 3rd time and flew to Bangkok. When later interviewed by customs and excise officers, Scripps said that he had flown out to Bangkok to meet a girl he had been writing to. On arrival in the Thai capital, he booked into the Liberty Hotel for 3 days, taking a cheap room costing about £10 a night. Accompanied by his girlfriend, he frequented a few bars and visited the local tourist attractions. Romance seemed to be in the air, and they made a trip to Ayutthaya, the historic former capital, where they stayed for 2 days. The couple then moved on to Pattaya, known as Sin City, and from there to Phuket, where they lived at Nilly's Marina Inn at Patong Beach. Scripps spent 10 days in Thailand before deciding to fly back to London. He had spent £1,000 during his sojourn in the East, including £270 on clothes and just over £100 buying 48 phony watches. He also bought a quantity of heroin. At 1:20 local time, Scripps boarded Gulf Air Flight GF 153, destination Muscat in the Sultanate of Oman. On arrival, he proceeded to the transit area of Sebe International Airport to await his connecting flight to Heathrow, London. He was traveling on a UK passport issued in the name of Jesse Robert Bola. This travel document, #348572V, had been stolen. While killing time in an airport bar, he met Christopher Davis, and the two men conversed as they waited for their flight. As Scripps prepared to board flight GF011 to London, he was subjected to a routine security check, which included a body frisk. Police Corporal Saeed Mubarak of the Royal Oman Police found 2 packages wrapped in red tape in his pockets. Thinking that the packages might contain explosives, he summoned assistance from Inspector Saeed Sobait. The 2 police officers went through Scripps's hand baggage, where they discovered a larger packet containing white powder. The dilemma for the authorities was that the white powder could not be tested without detaining the passenger. It was therefore decided to give one of the packets, which, as it later turned out, contained 50 g of diamorphine, and the passport to the captain. Scripps was then allowed to proceed to London, effectively under detention and the responsibility of the Gulf Air flight crew. Scripps nervously boarded the TriStar aircraft and settled into seat 39H. Midway through the flight, schoolteacher Gareth Russell, sitting in 39K, noticed his fellow passenger drop something on the floor and kick it under the seat. As soon as the aircraft entered British airspace, the pilot contacted HM Customs Excise, and moments after the plane had taxied to a stop, a rummage team headed by David Clark boarded the aircraft. The packet, which Scripps had kicked under seat, was found. After a field test for opiates had proved positive, he was charged under Section 3(1) of the Misuse of Drugs Act 1971, contrary to Section 172 of the Customs Excise Management Act 1979. John Scripps was held in custody that night to allow customs and police officers to search 6 Gordon Road, Farnborough, where he stayed, with his uncle, Ronald White. A folder of documents was found containing a West German passport in the name of Robert Alfred Wagner and a Belgian identity card in the name of Benjamin George Edmund Stanislas Balthier, with Scripps's photograph attached to it. The men named in these documents had been reported missing many years previously, and there has been no trace of them since. Later that day, Scripps was interviewed again, and he was asked how he earned his money, how he could afford to travel all over the world, and how he could afford a very expensive Samsonite suitcase. He cockily replied, "It may be very expensive to you, but it isn't to me. If you can't afford a suitcase like this, it's because you're working as minor subservients of the state for a standard wage, and you're not willing to go out and work all hours." At 10 p.m. on the 31st of August, Scripps was released in the name of John Martin and instructed to answer bail on the 29th of October, 1990. He failed to report, and on the 28th of November he was arrested by Detective Constable Malone at his mother's home at 11 Grove Road, Sandown, on the Isle of Wight. Police found more drugs, and he was charged with possession of 50 g of diamorphine at 80% purity. The street value of this amount was estimated at around £9,473, while the remaining 191.5 grams of heroin he had tried to smuggle through the airport was valued at £38,551. Given the knowledge that Scripps possessed drugs, valued at over £48,000, the police now understood how he could afford his jet-set lifestyle. Because Scripps had previously absconded from a 7-year custodial sentence for drugs offenses, he was held on remand in Winchester Prison until his trial. He instructed his solicitors that he would plead not guilty. His defense was simple enough. His case would stand or fall by his claim that he had found the red-taped package containing heroin on the ground at Muscat Airport and had handed it in to the police. He categorically denied that any drugs were found on his person at Muscat. Further, he argued that the traces of heroin found in the pockets of his jeans he was wearing at the time resulted directly in him being asked to open the package he had found containing drugs. He denied any knowledge whatsoever of the traces alleged to have been found in the pocket of a shirt. If he managed to wriggle out of that, he was still not completely out of the woods, for the police had found heroin on him during his arrest in Sandown, and his wallet had been stuffed with £2,000 in cash. The implication was that he intended peddling drugs on the Isle of Wight, yet another allegation that Scripps denied. Prisoner fee, $48,468. Scripps was given legal aid, and case #T 910602 was held at Winchester Crown Court on the 6th of January, 1991. Represented by Bruce Maddock QC, Scripps suddenly changed his plea to guilty in an effort to gain leniency. Despite this ploy, he was sentenced to 13 years imprisonment. Amazingly, he spent just 3 years and 10 months in jail before contriving another escape. Scripps started his prison term at Albany Prison on the Isle of Wight, and during a 6-week period between March and April 1993, he was instructed in butchery by prison officer James Quigley. He was shown how to bone out forequarters and hindquarters of beef, sides of bacon, carcasses of pork, and how to portion chicken, James Quigley said, adding, he was a quick learner and very fast on picking up on how to slaughter, dismember, and debone animals. What the authorities could never have guessed was that while they were training an inmate in butchery skills, they were also equipping him to slaughter and dismember humans, the gruesome calling to which he subsequently set his hand. Scripps's ultimate odyssey began on the 28th of October 1994, when he failed to return to the Mount Prison in Bovington, Hertfordshire, after 4 days' leave. Throughout the week before he walked out of the open prison gate, he had been openly selling his possessions to finance his escape. He had even bragged to fellow inmates that he was going on the run. This was picked up by the prison staff, who failed to act on it. When he failed to return, the governor, Margaret Donnelly, said he was no longer considered a risk. He had no history violence. He was quiet and reserved. What, it appears, the governor did not know was that Scripps had absconded from every home leave he had ever been granted. And far from being quiet, reserved, and no longer a risk, the smooth-talking drug dealer was about to become a vicious serial killer. After absconding, Scripps embarked on a globe-trotting 3-nation murder rampage. His first port of call before the killing started was Holland, where he met a former drug dealer whom he had encountered while on remand in Winchester Prison. He traveled next to Belgium and Spain and reached Mexico in late November, where he attempted a reconciliation with Maria Arellanos. He told her that he had been released from prison on a technicality, and that he was returning to Thailand to buy silk clothes and wanted them both to set up a boutique in Cancun. He told her that he was now a deeply religious man and, to convince her, became a devotee of the Virgin of Guadalupe, Mexico's patron saint. To finance this venture, Scripps befriended Timothy McDowell, a British backpacker who was holidaying in Belize and had traveled to Mexico in 1994. It is believed that he beat the 28-year-old Cambridge graduate and management consultant to death, dismembered his body, and dumped it in an alligator-infested river. Shortly after the murder, the victim's bank account was milked dry to the tune of £21,000, the money being transferred to Scripps's account in London. This sum of money was later moved to another account in the United States, under the name of Simon Davis, one of Scripps's many aliases. 33-year-old Gerard George Low arrived at Singapore's Changi Airport on the morning of the 8th of March, 1995, dressed casually in khaki Bermuda shorts and an orange t-shirt. He was indistinguishable from all the other international travelers as they stumbled wearily off the plane and onto the moving walkway. He was just another tourist, and that was the point. Traveling alone in a strange country, Low was looking for a friendly face, and as people do in airports, when they are trying to establish their bearings, he found himself talking to a complete stranger. The tall, soft-spoken Englishman in his 30s politely introduced himself as Simon Davis. As they chatted, Low explained that he was a South African brewery design engineer who was on a shopping trip to Singapore to take advantage of the low cost of video recorders and cameras. When Scripps caught sight of Low's gold credit card, he knew he had found another victim. It was apparent to Scripps that his new acquaintance was thrifty, so he suggested they share an hotel room. The Riverview Hotel was suggested by Scripps. This is a middle-class businessman's stopover with a graying marble reception area and a tacky boutique selling plastic orchids and Hong Kong girl perfume. The hotel was full and the two men had to wait several hours before they were given a room. They seemed very normal, as Roberto Pregarts, the hotel's manager, later testified at Scripps' trial. They were smiling and laughing together. There was nothing strange. Within minutes of booking in, the two men made their way to room 1511. After unpacking their cases, Low settled down at a small round table from which he could admire the panoramic view of Singapore, and, picking up a pen, started to compile his shopping list. Scripps chose this moment to steal up behind Low and brought down a 3 pounds camping hammer on his victim's head in a single crushing blow. After his capture and subsequent detainment in Changi prison, Scripps said of the murder, "I think he, Loa, was a bit surprised when I hit him. At first he thought I was mucking about. That made me mad with him because I thought that he was a homosexual. I threw him against the wall and he started to fall down. He was shaking and then he pissed himself. I knocked him about a bit and got him to tell me his bank card PIN number. When he was in the bathroom, he was conscious. There was water dribbling from his mouth. He gurgled, or something like that." Without a trace of emotion, Scripps added, "Well, I cut his throat and left him to bleed to death like a pig." After packaging the body parts in the black bin liners Gerald Low had brought with him to wrap up his duty-free purchases, Scripps deposited the bundles in the room's only wardrobe. He liberally sprayed Lynx deodorant around the room in an attempt to mask the smell of his own vomit. It proved inadequate, for a couple who stayed in room 1511 in the days that followed reported a strange fishy odor lingering around the room. Finally, Scripps washed his hands and cleaned up the bathroom. Again, he was not absolutely thorough and missed a few tiny spots on the shower curtain, door, and toilet bowl. These traces were to provide crucial evidence when he was eventually brought to court to answer the charge of murder. Murder, committed in this meticulous fashion, can rarely be a crime of passion. It is an eminently practical business, carried out with the studied objectivity of a professional. It requires thought, planning, and an ability to attend to every detail with cold-blooded efficiency. Scripps may have left traces of his butchery in the bathroom, but he demonstrated a clinical, unhurried persistence after the event. He started by practicing the forging of his victim's signature on tracing paper. His next move was to visit a computer shop where he told the sales assistant he was Gerald Lowe and he wanted to buy some laptop computers. By 9:00 p.m., he was back in the hotel's River Garden restaurant, sitting down to a plate of fillet steak and a bottle of white wine. It was a balmy evening. The string of multicolored lights around the patio reflected in the waters of the nearby Singapore River. John Scripps was at peace with the world. The next morning, Scripps informed the hotel receptionist that his companion had checked out and that he would settle the bill when he left. He then went on a spending spree in Singapore's glittering shopping malls. He threaded his way from one air-conditioned shop to another, using Lowe's Gold Card again and again. His first purchase was a pair of Iowa speakers, and then came a pair of Nike shoes and socks, as well as a video recorder, which he arranged to be sent to his sister in England. On the morning of the 9th of March, Scripps used the credit card for another shopping bonanza. He also drew $8,400 in cash from a local bank and made a telegraphic transfer of $11,000 to one of his accounts in San Francisco in the name of John Martin. He used the gold card to buy a $30 ticket to attend the Singapore Symphony Orchestra, where he heard a program of Brahms and Tchaikovsky. Finally, in an extraordinary, whimsical but callous bid to maximize his gains, he bought 5 big sweep lottery tickets. Later that night, he packed the dismembered body parts into a suitcase and caught a taxi to Singapore Harbor, where, under the cover of darkness, he dumped the gruesome contents into the waters swirling around Clifford Pier. The next day, flush with cash, he flew to Bangkok. Outside, Sheila Damood, a 49-year-old school administrator from Victoria, British Columbia, had flown into Bangkok for a 2-week stay with her son, who was on a gap year tour of the world. 22-year-old Darren had broken his leg while traveling with friends, and she wanted to give him some motherly attention. They had decided to take a tourist trip to the Thai paradise island of Phuket. On the 15th of March, mother and son arrived at Phuket Airport and were collecting their thoughts in the usual arrival turmoil when Scripps sidled up to them. "I was on the same plane as you. Do you have a problem?" he inquired. Within minutes, Scripps gleaned the information that Sheila and her son wanted to get to Patong Beach, but they were not sure how much to pay for a taxi. With his marauding instincts fully attuned, Scripps, ever the experienced traveler, told them about Nilly's Marina Inn, where a room would cost them about $18 a night. The small luxury hotel lay on the quiet southern end of Patong Beach, one of the most popular beaches on the island. He suggested that they share a taxi with him, which would give them all a cheap ride. Mother and son exchanged glances and nodded their agreement. They were clearly very impressed by this helpful young man, and soon they were on their way along the dusty roads to Patong Beach. Scripps signed himself in at Nilly's Marina Inn as Simon Davis, a shopkeeper from London. No one noticed in a revealing slip of the pen that he had inadvertently signed his name J. Davis. The consummate traveler, he had stayed there before, always drawing admiring looks from the pretty female staff who deferred to him as Mr. John. The Damoods caught the lift to the second floor and were shown into a spacious deluxe suite overlooking the bay. A Miami Vice view with jet skis and speedboats swooping onto white sands. Scripps took a nearby room just across the corridor, which overlooked scrubland at the back of the hotel. The Damoods had 2 king-sized beds, a well-appointed minibar, IDD telephone, color television, air conditioning, and a kitchen area. There was a separate bathroom and shower, and even a safe in which they could store their valuables. If the room was quite luxurious, especially at the low cost, the view from their window was priceless. Situated across from a long sandy beach and a narrow road was the crystal-clear water of the Andaman Sea. Looking out from their balcony, 2 tall palm trees grew out of the sandy soil, where 2 of the local girls were breaking open the coconuts. The girls looked up, and when they saw the handsome young Darren, they broke into giggles. At that moment the Damoods thought they had found heaven, but as the next day approached, they would be pitched into hell. Meanwhile, after a short walk to Patong's exciting nightlife, the Damoods spent the evening exploring the shops for silk garments. Scripps hired a high-powered 450cc Honda motorcycle and ended up on the seafront at the Banana Bar. Throbbing with music, the place was full of good-time girls who would sell their young bodies for less than the price of a meal. He danced the early hours away and had sex with a young woman on the beach before retiring for the night. The tourist police admired his yellow and green motorcycle parked on the double yellow lines outside the hotel and decided it was not good policy to issue a parking ticket to a holidaymaker. During the next morning, Sheila and Darren came down for breakfast, which they ate in the sunshine. After the meal, they searched the rather dismal fish tank for signs of life, and Sheila flicked through the postcard rack for something suitable to send to her husband back home. This was the last time they were seen alive. It is believed that they returned to their room to make plans for the day ahead. At about 11:00 a.m., people wandering about outside the small hotel next door noted a large flood of red-colored water flushing down an open drain that led from Nilly's Marina Inn to the sewer under the road. Because John Scripps has never been charged with the murders of Sheila and Darren Damood, he refused to discuss the case with me. Nevertheless, using the known evidence, it is possible to reconstruct what happened when the Damoods returned to their room at the inn. Scripps knocked on the door and entered their room on some pretext, and within seconds he had stunned them with a stun gun. Such a weapon was found in his possession when he was arrested. With his victims immobilized, he took out his hammer and beat them to death. Swabs from his hammer matched bloodstains on the carpet in the room occupied by the Damood, after which he dismembered their bodies using the butchery skills he had learned so adroitly at Albany Prison. After stealing his victims' travel documents, passports, and credit cards, he went on yet another shopping spree. The skulls, torsos, and several limbs belonging to the Damoods were found between 19 and the 27th of March, scattered around the local countryside. Also, during this time, a Thai woman, out walking her dog in the area, found other gruesome remains, partially tipped into a disused tin mine shaft. The identity of the victims was later confirmed using dental records. The Western world has become hardened to this kind of cold-blooded multiple murder. The gruesome details of the killings perpetrated by, for example, Kenneth McDuff, Harvey Carignan, and Peter Sutcliffe have become all too familiar. When the latest sensational murder case features in the headlines, we have the feeling that we have read it all before. Dismembered corpses, anonymous victims, apparently motiveless crime, and bizarre acts of violence have become common currency. But this is not so in Singapore, where violent crime and murder are unusual. In this draconically ordered city-state, where even the pavements seem to have been scrubbed clean and where the glass of the skyscraper sparkles spotless in the sun, crime comes in rather more sanitized forms. Famously harsh punishment awaits those who dare to drop litter or carelessly discard chewing gum. Here, taxis are fitted with a warning bell, which rings automatically if the driver exceeds the 50 miles per hour speed limit. It is not that Singaporeans have not encountered murder before. They have their share of domestic homicide, averaging fewer than 50 murders a year in a population of 2.5 million. Murders committed in the heat of the moment always seem to be more understandable. It it fell to Acting Superintendent Gerald Lim to lead the investigation into the crimes committed by John Scripps. At the time of Lowe's murder, he was the senior investigating officer with the Special Investigation Section of the CID, and his work began on the 13th of March, 1995, in Singapore Harbor, with the discovery of a pair of feet, which were poking out of a black bin liner and tied up with a pair of large blue Woolworths underpants. A boatman made the next discovery, for bobbing among the pleasure boats off Clifford Pier were two thighs, white, hairy, and bound with strips of orange fabric. Finally, on the 16th of March, a plump male torso was retrieved from the water. These gruesome remains belonged to the same male Caucasian body, but the head and arms of the body have never been recovered. Lim had dealt with fatal fights between immigrant building workers, and he had come across domestic murder, but this was something completely and horrifyingly different. He examined the green-tinged, rotting flesh and wondered at the person who could be responsible for such cold and calculating destruction of another human being. And this body was not just headless and armless, it was nameless. As most visitors to Singapore were registered as hotel guests, the detective's first stop was the centralized hotel registration computer. Within hours, a fax had been sent to every hotel in Singapore, asking if any guests were missing or who had left without paying their bill. The Riverview Hotel responded immediately. Two guests, Gerard Lowe and Simon Davis, had checked out of room 1511 without paying. But there was something else, the manager said. His duty reception staff recalled that the Englishman had been seen lugging a heavy suitcase through the foyer the night before he and his companion disappeared. It was also noted that when he returned to the hotel several hours later, he was empty-handed. On the 14th of March, the police in Johannesburg, South Africa, received a report from a distressed Mrs. Vanessa Lowe, who said that her husband was missing. He had not called her from Singapore to say that all was well, which she explained was totally out of character. Her concerns soon reached Gerald Lim, and he invited her to fly to Singapore to view the disarticulated body and a few items of wet clothing. Before Vanessa Lowe arrived, Lim had determined that Simon Davis's had been using his victim's gold credit card. Davis was now the prime suspect, and a warrant was issued for his arrest. Police now believed he had murdered Lowe for his money. When the distraught woman arrived, Superintendent Lim met her at the airport and, as delicately as he could, he asked her to identify the corpse. She bravely pointed out various marks on her late husband's body. She recognized the appendectomy scar on the abdomen, the freckles on the back, and the bony lump just below the right knee. She also identified the underpants, used by Scripps to tie up his victim's thighs, and the orange strips were from her husband's t-shirt. For some inexplicable reason, Scripps returned to Singapore on the 19th of March, and after a short struggle at immigration control, he was arrested and taken into custody. When officers opened the backpack of the man calling himself Simon Davis, which had been seized during his arrest, they were amazed at what they found. There, along with an Enjoy Coca-Cola beach towel, a Pink Floyd cassette, a bottle of Paul Mitchell shampoo, and some Featherlight condoms, was what they came to describe as a murder kit. Scripps was carrying a 10,000 volts force .3 stun gun, a 1.5 kilograms hammer, a can of mace, 2 sets of handcuffs, some thumb cuffs, 2 serrated knives, and 2 Swiss Army knives. And that was not all. Another of his bags was filled with clothes, suitable for a middle-aged woman, consisting of skirts, dresses, and even some pearl earrings. Hidden among them were passports in the names of 2 Canadian citizens, Sheila and Darren DeMood, each of them containing crudely pasted-in photographs of Scripps. He was also found to be carrying more than $40,000 in cash and traveler's checks, together with the passports, credit cards, and other belongings of Lova and the Damoods. In the Singapore equivalent of committal proceedings, the preliminary inquiry saw written statements from as many as 77 witnesses for the prosecution supporting the murder charge, and 11 other charges ranging from forgery, vandalism, and cheating to possession of weapons and small quantities of controlled drugs. Douglas Herda, representing the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, also wanted to question Scripps about the murders of Sheila and Darren Damood in Phuket. The Singaporean authorities refused his request. The trial of John Scripps started on the 2nd of October 1995 in Singapore's new high-tech court. Security was heavy throughout the session, with Scripps sitting between two armed, uniformed officers in a glass and metal cage. His legs were shackled to a metal bar. He had entered no plea but claimed trial, which, under Singapore law, means he was contesting the charges. Singapore does not have trial by jury. A judge alone hears the evidence. The first witness was James Quigley, who testified that he had taught Scripps butchery in Albany Prison. Chow Tse Cheng, a government pathologist, said that the manner in which Lo's body had been cut up indicated that only a doctor, a veterinarian, or a butcher could have dismembered it. "I told the police, 'Look, you are dealing with a serial killer,'" he said in his evidence. The prosecution alleged that Scripps, using a false name, had checked into the same hotel room as Lo and killed him. In what amounted to a confession, Scripps told the court he met Lo at Changi Airport on the 8th of March, and they had agreed to share a hotel room. He admitted killing him in the room after he was awakened by a half-naked Lo, who was smiling and touching his buttocks. "I am not a homosexual," claimed Scripps, "and at that time it appeared to me that Mr. Lo was a homosexual. I freaked out. I kicked out and started swearing. I had experience of such things in the past, and I was very frightened." Scripps said he used the hammer to hit Lo several times on the head until he collapsed onto the carpeted floor. "My right hand was covered with blood. Everything happened so quickly." After realizing Lova was dead, Scripps testified he sought the help of a British friend, whom he refused to name. The friend disposed of the body without telling him how. He denied that he cut up the body. The defense, led by Joseph Teixeira, tried to show that Scripps had not intended to kill Lo, and that the murder was an act of manslaughter, which carried a maximum penalty of life in prison. The prosecution claimed that he committed premeditated murder with the intention of robbing the dead man. On the fourth day of the trial, prosecutor Jennifer Marie said that Scripps had practiced forging Lo's signature, suggesting that the murder was premeditated. She showed the court items seized from his luggage, including a notebook and tracing paper with practiced signatures of Lo's name. In a nitpicking exercise, the defense questioned two police officers, trying to show how they conducted an inadequate search for blood traces next to the hotel room bed, where Scripps claimed Lo fell and bled to death. Both officers said there were no traces of blood on the carpet, only in the small bathroom. The prosecution argued that this evidence supported their contention that the killing was premeditated. Clearly on a losing wicket, Pereira implied that if the police found no blood traces on the carpet, it could have been because they did not conduct sufficiently thorough tests and not in the exact spot where Lua fell. During the court proceedings on the 24th of October, Scripps said that while in police custody after being arrested, he had tried to commit suicide by slitting his wrists with a small, sharp piece of glass to escape being hanged. "I believed I was going to be hung," the 35-year-old man said on his fifth day in the witness box. "I kept thinking about Louvre and the Filipino lady that got hanged." He was referring to the Filipino maid, Flor Contemplacion, who was hanged on the 17th of March, 1995, after she confessed to 2 murders. Now digging his own grave, Scripps agreed with the suggestion by Judge T.S. Sinatharai that it would take about 5 minutes for a skilled butcher to dismember an animal. Then the prosecutor jumped in. "Could your skills be used to dismember a human?" "The bones look similar," Scripps replied. Cutting to the chase, Jennifer Marie asked again, "Did you dismember Mr. Lowe?" Scripps looked down at his shackled legs and replied unconvincingly, "No, I don't have all the skills you mentioned." On his 6th day on the stand, Scripps was asked by the prosecutor why he did not report killing Lowe to the police. "Because this man died at my hands," he said, "and under Singapore law, that is an automatic death sentence. That's what I understood at the time." "So who is the mystery man who dismembered Mr. Lowe?" asked the prosecutor. "He is a British friend staying at a hotel on Sentosa. While he was doing it, I fled." Scripps said he had known this friend for 8 to 10 years and remembered that he had once worked at an abattoir. "He's a very dangerous man," he said meekly. "I fear for the safety of my family." The judge then cautioned Scripps that his reluctance to give even basic information on his friend could harm his defense. "Here you are facing a murder charge," the judge reminded him, "which carries the death sentence in this country. I have to ask myself at the end of the day this question: did the accused, John Scripps, go to a hotel on Sentosa?" Sitting back in his seat, the judge sighed as Scripps still declined even to describe the hotel, a refusal which prompted the prosecutor to accuse the defendant of lying and that the activities of his friend were all a complete fabrication. Discrepancies between Scripps's earlier statements to the police on the 29th of April and his testimony from the witness stand were also highlighted. "You made no mention of attempted homosexual assaults while in prison in 1978 and the alleged 1994 assault by Mr. Lowe, did you?" "I am suggesting that this 1994 incident never occurred," said Marie. "It's yet another fabrication of yours." With Scripps now firmly on the hook, the prosecutor started to reel him in. Pressed about his movements between 8 and the 11th of March, Scripps said that his memory was hopeless. "You have got a good memory?" he was asked. "I haven't," he replied nervously. "I'm dyslexic. I get things mixed up." On the 6th of November, Jennifer Marie told the court in her closing arguments, "The conduct of the accused after the killing suggests that he was cold, callous, and calculating, a far cry from the confused, dazed, forgetful man walking in a dream world, the picture he gives himself. He is a man very much in control of his faculties. When he embarked on the shopping spree using Lowe's credit card, buying a fancy pair of running shoes, a video cassette recorder, and a ticket to a symphony orchestra concert, he becomes a man who has no qualms about lying continuously, consistently, and even on the stand." She added, with rare touch of venom, "This man's excuse that he killed Mr. Lowe because of a homosexual advance is just one of a string of lies to mask a premeditated murder by a greedy serial killer who preyed on tourists. And Mrs. Lowe has stated on oath, a decent loving wife has come here to say that her husband had come here on a shopping holiday. He most certainly was not a homosexual. The accused has not only murdered and dismembered her husband, he now rubbishes his good name." In his closing statement for the defense, Edmund Pereira said, "We urge this court to come to a finding that the accused is not guilty of murder, but is guilty of culpable homicide, not amounting to murder. The killing occurred in a sudden fight, in the heat of passion, upon a sudden quarrel," and he added, "He is not a man prone to violence." Pereira also urged Judge Sinatharai to ignore the information from Thailand. "There is no evidence to suggest that the accused is responsible for the deaths of the 2 Canadians," he said. calling the Thai information nothing more than circumstantial and prejudicial. On the 7th of November 1995, Scripps, dressed in khaki, with a prison-style crew cut and standing in the court's glass cage, was said to be laughing and joking with his guards before the verdict. Karma is karma. It's in God's hands now, but his attitude changed within minutes. The judge told the packed courtroom, "I am satisfied beyond a reasonable doubt that Scripps had intentionally killed Lowe." After that, he disarticulated Lowe's body into separate parts, and it was he who subsequently disposed of the body parts by throwing them into the river behind the hotel. Having announced the guilty verdict, Judge T.S. Sinathurai sentenced Scripps to death by hanging. The condemned man was less glib as he was taken away to a place of lawful execution. After the verdict, defense lawyer Edmund Pereira told reporters, "Scripps has a right to an appeal, which he can exercise within 14 days, and he shall be advised of that right." Privately, in an interview for the research for this book, the judge said that he was convinced that Scripps had killed the Damudes, but added that he decided Scripps's guilt independently of the Thai evidence. "On the evidence, I had no difficulty to find that it was Scripps who was concerned with the deaths of Sheila and Darren, and for the disposal of their body parts found in different sites in Phuket. The disarticulation of the body parts of Loa, Sheila, and Darren had all the hallmark signs of having been done by the same person. The Thai evidence was materially relevant because it rebutted Scripps's defense that he killed Lou unintentionally during a sudden fight. Upon hearing the news at her home in Sandown, Isle of Wight, his mother, 58-year-old Jean Scripps, said, "I brought John into this world. I am the only person who has the right to take him out. I cannot believe how my boy could have changed from a kind human being into the monster described in court." On the 4th of January 1996, John Martin Scripps virtually signed his death warrant when he wrote to the prison authorities to withdraw his appeal, which was scheduled to be heard on the 8th of January, but confirmed he would file for a clemency plea. This was the only sensible avenue open to him, and he had a brief 6 to 8 week window of opportunity to complete the paperwork. The death penalty was in use during the colonial period in Singapore and was retained after the city-state became an independent republic in August 1965. Today, death sentences may be imposed for various offenses under the Penal Code, the Internal Security Act, 1960, the Misuse of Drugs Act, 1973, as amended in 1975, and the Arms Offences Act. Capital offenses include murder, treason, hurting or imprisoning the president, offenses relating to the unlawful possession of firearms and explosives, and perjury resulting in the execution of a person indicted on a capital charge. The 1975 amendment to the Misuse of Drugs Act made the death penalty mandatory for possession of over 15 g of heroin or fixed amounts of other drugs. Capital offenses are tried before the High Court. The defendant has the right of appeal against conviction to the Court of Criminal Appeal, and legal counsel is guaranteed by law. On the dismissal of an appeal, prisoners may seek permission to appeal to the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council in England, which serves as the final court of appeal for Singapore. If the Privy Council upholds a sentence, prisoners may submit a clemency petition to the President of Singapore. On the 14th of February 1996, a spokesperson from the British High Commission in Singapore visited Scripps in prison. Afterwards, she told reporters he won't be putting in an appeal. He's eager to get it over and done with. He's just waiting for the day, she said. This comment surprised Edmund Pereira, who was moved to say, "There are some instructions Scripps has given to me, but I'm not at liberty at this stage to make any comment because the matter has not been finalized," he said, adding, But even if a prisoner refused to petition for clemency, the matter still has to go before the president. However, if we don't request clemency, they won't exercise clemency. While he was being held in solitary confinement at Changi, Scripps spent most of his time watching television and reading. A priest visited him weekly, and once a fortnight, a consular representative went to check on his welfare and to pass on messages from his family. The Singapore Sunday Times newspaper reported on the 10th of March that Scripps had declined to seek a pardon from President Ong Teng Cheong. It was his wish to let the law take its course, the story concluded. It was announced that John Scripps was to die at dawn on Friday, the 19th of April. He had turned down a request by Scotland Yard detectives to interview him about the murder of British backpacker Timothy McDowell in Mexico in 1994. He spent his last 2 days writing garbled love poems to his former Mexican wife, Maria, described as the one true love of his life, from his cell. He was confined in a windowless cubicle, measuring 8 feet by 6 feet, illuminated 24 hours a day, and kept under continuous surveillance by a camera. There was a hole-in-the-ground lavatory and a straw roll mat to sleep on. His sister Janet and mother Jean said their farewells to him in his cell 12 hours before his execution. They had turned down an offer to be present at his death. Janet said in an interview with the author, "How do you say goodbye to your own brother like that? We didn't actually say the word. I just couldn't." In a semi-literate scrawl on a scrap of paper, Scripps wrote that he had given himself to God, who had betrayed him. "You may take my life for what it's worth, but grant thous I love, peace, sick, and happiness." For his last meal, he asked for a pizza and a cup of hot chocolate. He then requested another scrap of paper and left a final, rambling note which read, "One day poor, one day rich. Money fills the pain of hunger, but what will the emptiness inside? I know that love is beyond me, so do I give myself to God, the God that has betrayed me. You may take my life for what it is worth, but grant those I love peace and happiness. Can I be a person again? Only time will tell me. What really upset me was when you are told every day that you are not a member of the human race." In accordance with the execution procedure, hangings are carried out in private, on a large gallows, in Changi Prison, which can accommodate up to 7 prisoners at a time. Hangings are carried out with a black hood covering the head and the use of the long drop method. The recommended drop is based on the need to produce a force of 1,260 pounds on the neck and upper spine region of the condemned person as he plunges through the trap. This figure divided by the prisoner's weight in pounds gives the length of drop in feet. Therefore, to kill instantaneously, it is crucial to get these calculations correct. It is also normal practice in Singapore to hang several prisoners simultaneously, although no specific details of the executions are released to the media. The official version, which is issued for every execution as a matter of policy, was that John Scripps was woken by guards at about 3:30 a.m., and escorted to a waiting room where he and 2 other prisoners, 2 Singaporean drug traffickers, were prepared. He spoke to a priest and a prison chaplain before his time came, when he walked bravely to his death. The relatives of Scripps's partners on the gallows received identical letters, with only the names being changed. The apparently smooth procedure was later thrown into disarray when the priest, who had been in attendance at the execution, unexpectedly resigned. As part of his clerical duties, he had witnessed most of the executions at Changi during the previous 10 years. But he was so horrified by the death of John Scripps that he resigned immediately afterwards. And far from walking bravely to his death, Scripps had put up a fight to the bitter end. The guards did indeed come for John Scripps at 3:30 a.m. He was ordered to step out of his prison-issue shorts, to avoid soiling them with urine and excrement, and told to dress in his civilian clothes. John refused, so his prison garb was torn from him. He should have been weighed to calculate the drop. However, he had told me that he would give his jailers an execution to remember, for he hated his prison guards, who daily reminded him that he was not a member of the human race. Crucially, he refused to be weighed for the drop, with all the consequences that might have for the efficiency and humaneness of his execution. Too long a drop, and he could be decapitated. Too short a drop, and he could strangle to death at the end of the rope. In the event, it took 12 guards 20 minutes to drag him to the holding cell next to the gallows. During this struggle, he sustained a broken nose, cheekbone, jaw, 2 black eyes, and multiple bruising. As the appointed time drew near, John was heard to be sobbing. The 2 other doomed men were already pinioned and hooded on the trap when he was prepared. Again he lashed out before being bound with leather straps. Now neutralized, naked and tightly buckled, he lost control of his body functions. Quickly, a rubber bung was forced between his teeth. Then came the hood, followed by the rope, which was snapped tight under his left ear, a pull on a lever, and John Scripps plunged into eternity. For half an hour his body swung silently in the pit before being taken down. The consequences of the failure to calculate a proper drop were only too obvious, for his head had almost been ripped from his body. At 10:30 a.m., Scripps left prison for the last time. Wrapped in a white sheet and placed in a cardboard coffin, his body joined the other 2 corpses in an old green tarpaulin-covered truck and taken to a funeral parlor in Sin Ming Drive. The 2 Singaporeans were dropped off for cremation en route. When John Scripps, with her daughter, viewed the body, she almost fainted. With the press pack beating on the funeral parlor door, they finally made good their escape, and John was cremated later that afternoon at the Republic's expense. In a final irony, John Scripps spent that night at the Riverview Hotel. The urn containing his ashes was in the charge of one of the representatives of the Scripps family, lots having been drawn to decide who should have this responsibility. On their arrival in England and at a private service attended only by relatives and close friends, the ashes were scattered at a secret location. John Martin Scripps had followed the tourist trail to Thailand and Phang Nga, popularly known as James Bond Island, which was one of the film locations for The Man with the Golden Gun. While there, he had his photograph taken and printed on a souvenir plate. "I can't believe he killed them," said Nipa Imsum Ang, the receptionist at Nili's Marina Inn. "He was not crazy. I liked him very much," she added. "He was always smiling, smiling, smiling." Locals say she has become nervous about ghosts since Scripps was convicted, though she seemed nonplussed when asked whether hotel business had suffered in the aftermath of the murder. Everyone who knew Scripps agrees he seemed a really nice guy. During his trial, he looked sensible, decent even, and chatted politely to his guards about the weather. Once, when the judge sneezed, he turned around and said quietly, "Bless you." The Roman Catholic priest, whom John called Father Frank, said, "I tried to imagine how his face would have looked when he was chopping up the bodies," concluding, "It's impossible. I can only see him as he was with me, young, handsome, soft-spoken, and gentle." This is an all-too-familiar perception. When people meet serial killers, they often think they are shy, quiet, nice people who are not easily upset. The reality is that of the over-controlled personality, which may well lead to occasional outbursts of rage in appropriate situations. So what was Scripps's motive? Was it the lure of money that drove him to kill? Strangely, in view of his actions, many observers think that this was unlikely. He robbed his victims, but there was more to it than that. as Brian Williams, liaison officer for the Royal Canadian Mounted Police in Bangkok, said, "You can rob without killing, and you can kill without cutting up the body into bits. This man went to such an extreme, and I can only think that he relished what he was doing." Brian Williams may well be correct in his common-sense appraisal, but ultimately, it comes down to a common enough motive, and this, I believe, boils down to financial gain. Scripps was a cold, calculating killer who had planned his MO almost to perfection. His butchery skills merely added to the clinically efficient way he disposed of bodies. That here list the dismemberment is open to debate. John Scripps was neither insane nor mad in the medical or legal sense. When he killed Gerard Lowe in their hotel room in Singapore, he was deluding himself if he believed that the island republic's system of justice would not hand down a death sentence to an Englishman. As an experienced traveler in Southeast Asia, he must have known that some countries in the region have an unequivocal attitude to murder and drug smuggling, crimes which carry a mandatory death sentence. For their part, the Singapore authorities are tough on criminals. The Deputy Superintendent of Police, Chin Fook Leon, said to me during an interview, "We impose the maximum sentence of death without concern for race, color, or creed. Break the penal code in Singapore," he warned, "and suffer the consequences." The deterrent value of the death sentence in Singapore is there for all to consider. If there is an intention to break the law, it is even printed on red and white notices prominently posted around the city. Singaporeans argue that it is effectively the individual's own choice. Go against the law of the country and suffer the consequences, and this uncompromising attitude is always applied. 5 Thai men who entered Singapore illegally as laborers and were held as guests of the Republic took it upon themselves to abuse their hosts by robbing construction sites between November 1991 and January 1993. In committing their crimes, they murdered a citizen of Myanmar and 2 Indian nationals. Panya Marmantri, 22, Prawit Yawa Bhutar, 22, Manit Wangjay Suk, 31, Panya Amphawa, 29, and Prasong Bunsam, 32, were sentenced to death on the 16th of January 1995. Their appeals against execution were dismissed on the 10th of July, and they were duly hanged at Changi Prison on Friday the 16th of March, 1996. Thai Ambassador His Excellency Adisak Panupong told me, "My countrymen were aware of the laws and punishments of Singapore, and, in breaking them, they also knew what the consequences might be. The decision was theirs to make." John Scripps had made visits to the Far East before he killed Gerard Lowe, and therefore knew and understood the law very well. He was aware of the risks of committing serious crime in both Singapore and Thailand, and of the consequences of being arrested and found guilty of drug smuggling and committing murder. When he killed Gerard Lowe, he did so for financial profit, and the Singapore authorities took the view that by committing this murder on their soil, he merely validated his own execution. It is consistent with this outlook that he demonstrated, by his unlawful behavior, that murder was permissible. As far as the Singapore authorities were concerned, those were his standards, and he was treated accordingly. Consideration of punishment, whether it meant life in prison or execution, was also determined by John's own actions. It was not his victim, the police, the Singapore judicial system, the Department of Prisons, or the executioner who initiated the sequence of events leading to his death by the judicial process. It was down to John Scripps himself, and if he had escaped the noose in Singapore, what would have been his fate in Thailand? It would have been execution by machine gun. Legislation in Thailand has now been extended to include imposition of the death penalty for offenses other than murder. The Royal Act on Habit-Forming Drugs, 1979, introduced an optional death penalty for possession of more than 100 g of heroin while maintaining a mandatory death sentence for its production, import, or export. Although Thailand is reluctant to implement the death penalty in respect of convicted Europeans, who usually receive commutations by royal pardon, the number of people under sentence of death and the number of executions carried out on Europeans have been rising steadily. It seems, therefore, that John was playing a lethal game, with his own life also at stake. Not only did he risk the death sentence for international drug trafficking, he had committed 2 counts of aggravated homicide, which carries the mandatory death sentence in Thailand. A final dimension to his recklessness was provided by Singapore Drugs squad officers, who discovered a substantial amount of heroin in a safety deposit box he had rented in the city. This was his stash, which on its own was enough to send him to prison for the rest of his life. It seems that he was doomed in any event.